You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
If I would have mentioned the name of Uncle Sam, you'd most likely get this image of a stern, elderly man with a white beard, and he's wearing a top hat that's adorned with stars and a blue jacket, and he is pointing directly back at you. But did you know that Uncle Sam, the name synonymous with the U.S. government, is believed to have originated from a real person named Samuel Wilson? And believe it or not, he lived just a short distance from my house in the city of Troy, New York. And with July 4th, our Independence Day, just around the corner, I thought it'd be fun to go in search of the real Uncle Sam. I mean, who is this man? Well, our guide for this Uncle Sam tour is Kathy Sheehan, the historian for both Rensselaer County and the city of Troy. Kathy is also the executive director of the Hart Cluett Museum, which is the Rensselaer County Museum, and is operated by the Rensselaer County Historical Society. Kathy was last a guest on this podcast about 2 years ago, and that's when we recorded episode number 178. In it, we debunked many of the myths surrounding Russell Sage. This time, she's going to take us to locations in and around the city of Troy that played a significant part in the life of Uncle Sam Wilson. And I have to tell you, aside from our first and last stops, I really didn't know where Kathy was taking me, but she had a fantastic story to tell. So join Kathy and me as we take to the road and go in search of the man who would become Uncle Sam. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
I met up with Kathy Sheehan just outside of the two 19th century townhouses that make up the Hart Cluett Museum. These buildings, like so many others in the historic part of the city, are just spectacular to look at. If you've ever seen the HBO series The Gilded Age, then you've not only seen the exterior of the museum, but you've also seen quite a number of the buildings on the surrounding streets. A little side note is that Kathy served as the historical advisor, although I'm not sure of her official title. She served as a historical advisor for the series while they were filming in Troy. Now, if you're not familiar with Troy, New York, the city is located on the eastern bank of the Hudson River, about 135 miles or 217 kilometers directly north of New York City. Our state capital, which is Albany, it's on the opposite side of the river, and it's about 5 miles or 8 kilometers downstream. In other words, closer to New York City. The story that Kathy's about to tell you is of two brothers, Ebenezer and Samuel Wilson, and they moved from New Hampshire to Troy in 1789. That just happened to be the same year that the city adopted the name of Troy. The brothers, they found great success in Troy, both in brickmaking and in the packing of meats. But how Samuel Wilson eventually became known as Uncle Sam is quite the story, and that's what Kathy is about to explain. Our first stop was on Mount Ida in Troy's Prospect Park, and it spans 80 acres and sits high up on the bank of the river. From there, one can see the entire city, which lies about 250 feet or 75 meters below. Just a quick note before I play the audio, there was a technical problem with the wireless microphones I intended to use. Basically, one of the two mics wouldn't connect, so I had to turn to plan B. What that meant is I had to use a handheld recorder with lower audio quality, so you may hear some distortion, and I do apologize for that. One other thing I should mention is that Kathy talks about the Wilsons' grazing fields extending all the way to Hoosick Street from the park. That's about 1 mile or 1.6 kilometers away from where it was standing. In other words, they owned a huge farm. Anyway, let's join up with Kathy in Prospect Park. So Kathy, thanks for joining me again on the podcast. And here we are in Prospect Park. And before we dive into Uncle Sam, I thought we'd do a little disclaimer about Uncle Sam. So why don't you quickly talk about he's not necessarily the only claim for Uncle Sam.
Well, it's interesting. And thank you for having me on this podcast. I enjoy this. It's interesting because we have two different stories here. We have the story about Samuel Wilson, who was here in Troy. And we also have the legend story about Uncle Sam. And there are several communities that will claim the fame of Uncle Sam, who is the progenitor of our nation's symbol. And we'll get into that a little bit later into this podcast. But yes, other communities around the country, as well as even internationally, have claim that they are the official home of Uncle Sam, and I say that with air quotes.
So why don't you quickly describe where we're standing?
Well, we are on Mount Ida, which is one of the high elevation points in Troy, and it is now known as Prospect Park. And this is where Ebenezer and Samuel Wilson, who arrived over from Massachusetts in 1789, as Troy was just becoming a village, officially becoming a village named Troy. And they settled up here, and they started fruit orchards along the sides of the hill, and they started a brick-making business. The whole hill is very much clay. We have a lot of clay here in Troy. So they started this brick-making business. They built the first courthouse, our first Rensselaer County courthouse. It was on 2nd and Congress Street. And then they had these fruit orchards up here. And then they started getting into the business of grazing beef and pork. So there was the grazing lands extended north from where we are, all the way over to Hoosick Street, on the area, if people are familiar with the area of 8th Street. So those are the grazing lands. And they had a small cabin up here. And so this was their very first home, was up here on land that had belonged to Philip Hart. No relation to our Hart Clue Museum, but Heartt. So this is the first home.
Now, one part of the story that I keep reading over and over again is that Ebenezer and Samuel, they walked all the way here from New Hampshire. Now, even driving that distance is several hours today. So do you want to talk about that a bit?
You know, legends as they grow, and it sounds very, romantic and exciting that, and adventurous that these two young men, are crossing the mountains on foot. Probably wasn't true. Everybody had horses, and you would basically, you would refresh the horses. People rented to buy them, swap them. There was all sorts of different things that people did to bring your horses, or they just, they're able to keep their main horse, and you took your time getting here. Mm-hmm. So I think that's probably not true. I think that just kind of rolls into the legend of Uncle Sam, this kind of romanticized vision of what was going on in the early, late 18th century.
So we're way up high on the bank, way up above Troy. We're above the city itself. Right. Now, where we're standing, there's trees everywhere. You really can't see very far. Was it like that when they were here?
Oh, gosh, no. No, this was all cleared, and you could see south and over to the Helderbergs, and you could see north up to the Adirondacks and west out to the Mohawk Valley. It really was this high ground was unobstructed view. It's only been in the last 60 years that a lot of these trees have grown up as the park really came into place. Yeah, it was all opened. Yeah. And there was clay on the side of the hill. Again, they were mining the clay, taking the clay off the side of the hill for various things, not only just for brick making, but then they were taking the topsoil off to fill in different areas in the city as neighborhoods grew up as well. So, yeah, no, it was pretty open.
And the population was very small at that time, I would assume.
Yeah, we had a couple thousand people at that time when they came in, but it started to grow very rapidly because Troy is really at the headwaters of the Hudson River. So Troy almost, in effect, really kind of becomes a port city. So it becomes a very important conduit. And certainly by 1824, when the Erie Canal opens, then everything really explodes. We're really a crossroads trade route here.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know nobody can see where we are because it's audio, but can you just kind of describe where their cabin would have been?
Yeah, so we're at the north end of the park, of Prospect Park now, on Mount Ida. And there's kind of a rise on the ground, and which is actually where some of the foundations of the Warren Mansion. The Warrens were the next family who came up here on the park. And really built their house pretty much almost in the same footprint as Samuel and Ebenezer's little cottage. Theirs was a much grander Gothic revival, beautiful summer home, thinking about coming up out of the city. They had a home down in the flats in downtown, and then they had another home up here.
We then hopped into the car and drove a short distance to the park's Uncle Sam Memorial. But I have to tell you, the best part of this location is not the memorial, it's the view. Let's listen in. So, Kathy, we've changed location, so why don't you describe where we are?
We are at the western slopes of Mount Ida, still up here in Prospect Park, and we are looking at downtown Troy, and to the west we can see the Congress Street Bridge and the West Troy and Watervliet, all the way up to Latham. If you really craned our head, we can kind of see the foothills of the Adirondacks on a good day. And just below us is where all this brick came from. These are all clay hills here. And so this is where Samuel and Ebenezer started their brick factory that made the bricks for the courthouse and several other early buildings that were here. And he lived, his house on Ferry Street, where he died in 1854, was just below the hill on the right on Ferry Street. That house was torn down during urban renewal.
And what I'll do is I'll put a picture of what we're looking at on my website, uselessinformation.org. But Kathy, you grew up around here, and my wife and I have come to this park many times over the years. We don't live too far away. And I have to say, it's beautiful to walk around, but it's clear that it's not in the same state that it was years ago. So why don't you describe what it was like when you were younger?
Yeah, in its heyday, we had the big pool, which was the Wesley Bintz pool, which was the first prototype above-ground municipal pool. That no longer is functioning. That stopped. They stopped that in around the early 1990s. And the park has seen better days, but there's a wonderful park conservancy, and so they continue to reclaim the park and do a lot more. You'll see a lot more benches than there were even 10 years ago, and some wonderful plantings in the spring. And there's now Frisbee golf course up here. So it's being worked on, and it's a great dedicated group of volunteers that works closely with the city.
Next, we drove to a spot that I had been to before, and that's because I have a stained glass window that came from a warehouse they ripped down about 25 years ago. It stood right opposite to where we were standing. But believe it or not, I never realized the historical significance of what was once there. So Kathy, we're now down in the city, and I should mention that there's some heavy equipment operating near us, but why don't you describe where we are?
So we are at the corner of Adams and First Street, and we're about 2 blocks from the Hudson River, so we're really down in the flats here in Troy. Actually, this is our early suburbs, but in 1793, this is where Samuel and Ebenezer had their meat factory here. They employed almost 200 people, and this is where they were taking care of that beef and pork that they were supplying to the troops in Greenbush that were at the cantonment. And down in what is now the city of Rensselaer. And so they answered the ad by Albert Anderson. They needed to get barrels of beef and pork packed into good brine in good oak barrels, and the barrels needed to be stamped USEA, standing for United States and Albert Anderson. And so this is where our story and the legend starts to unfold between Samuel and Ebenezer Wilson and Uncle Sam the legend.
Next, we drove about 7 miles or 11.25 kilometers south of Troy to a housing development known as Hampton Manor. We then parked in the parking lot of the Red Mills School there, and in fact, you'll hear the kids playing on the playground. And then we walked along a road to view an immense wooden building that was hidden in the woods beside the school. Unfortunately, as we stood there, it started to rain, so we had to cut this visit short. Kathy, once again, we've changed locations, so why don't you describe where we are?
We are now in the city of Rensselaer, and at the time, during the War of 1812, this was Bath-on-Hudson, and we're very close to the Hudson River, and what we are standing in front of is the last remaining officers' barrack for the cantonment that was here. During the War of 1812, there were 5,000 troops that were stationed here at this cantonment. This became a really important spot for supplies and troop movements for all the troops coming up from New York and New Jersey fighting during the War of 1812, which was predominantly fought way up in northern New York on Lake Champlain. Think of Battle of Plattsburgh and things like that. And so it was pretty much a naval war. And so this really was the staging area for that, but they did have a hospital and everything on the grounds, and even a prison, all sorts of warehouses. So it covered a huge area, many, many buildings. And I said, this is the only one left. It is behind the Red Mill School, and it's now a private home. Actually, it's a bunch of apartments, but it basically looks exactly the same on the exterior as it did during the War of 1812.
Now, Kathy, how did they get all the supplies here? I mean, you're talking about, Sam Wilson and his brother are producing the meat and other things up in Troy, and here we are down the Hudson River. Did they bring it down the river, or did they bring it overland?
So we were at the slaughterhouse on the corner of First and Adams Street, and there was a ferry there, and they would put all those barrels of beef, in the good brine, and they would be shipping them right down the Hudson River. Again, remember, we've got a navigable Hudson all the way up to Troy, and they would be brought here to the cantonment right off the Hudson. If you're familiar in this area where the train station is, you would have the docks there, and then they were brought over here for the storehouses for the cantonment, and then they again would be in turn shipped back on the Hudson River, going up the river to where they needed them up in upstate New York.
Now, this is the spot that Uncle Sam actually got his nickname. Is that correct?
This is correct. So those barrels are stamped USEA, and so as those barrels are being taken off the docks by the troops, and Sam Wilson's, there were almost 200 people working in that slaughterhouse. Some of them were nephews of his, as the legend goes, and they would have referred to him as Uncle Sam. And the soldiers are looking at the barrels that are marked, and they're going, "Oh, here comes Uncle Sam and his beef." So this is kind of where we think the legend starts, because those barrels being stamped USEA, standing for United States, and Albert Anderson, who is the other unknown figure in this whole story.
So, Kathy, why don't you tell us a little bit about Albert Anderson?
So I find this fascinating as part of this whole story, and I think it's been kind of forgotten. Those barrels that were marked USEA, one was for United States, and Albert Anderson really is the government contractor. He is the one who is hired by the United States government to supply beef and pork to the troops. He subcontracts to get Samuel and Ebenezer Wilson. They're the ones that answer his ad. And so what happened was he turned around and they get all the beef, the 15,000 pounds of beef and pork, and they present their bill to Albert Anderson, and Albert Anderson pays them during the War of 1812. So when the war finished, Albert Anderson presents his bill to the U.S. government saying, "Okay, here, I've done my part." And the U.S. government says, maybe not so fast. Maybe you've been also supplying beef and pork to the British, which maybe would not have been out of the realm of possibility if anyone's familiar with northern New York. Not a whole lot going on up there, and you would have been struggling to get supplies, maybe from the Canadian side or, however that worked. But they never were able to prove it, but he had to keep petitioning Congress every single year for his money. And they kept saying, no, we're still investigating. Albert Anderson dies a few years later, and he never sees a dime of the money that he invested in hiring Sam and Ebenezer and, to get all this. And his wife and his son continued to petition Congress, and they finally ended up, about maybe 10 or 15 years later, finally got about 25% of what was ultimately owed to him, with never any other explanation why they kept, because they never could prove that he was buttering both sides of the bread, so to speak.
We're just in Hampton Manor, which lies south of Troy. Next, we head to the northern portion of Troy to the Lansingburgh section to visit the spectacular Oakwood Cemetery. And I am not exaggerating, it is an incredible cemetery to visit. As the crow flies, we're now about 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers north of the Hart-Cluett Museum and downtown Troy. So, Kathy, we've changed location. We're now at Oakwood Cemetery, which is the northern part of Troy. And I should point out that it is raining out, so we're sitting in the car looking at a couple of tombstones. So why don't you describe what's going on here?
Yes, so as this wonderful cemetery that was the first burials were put in 1848. It's part of the rural cemetery movement, and we are up in the north part of Lansingburgh of Troy. And what we're looking at is a small area of gravestones that were reinterred from the State Street burial ground. And 2 of Samuel and Betsy Mann Wilson's children are buried in this site. Now we will be heading over to where Samuel and Betsy are buried, but these were all reinterred in 1875 when they were building City Hall. 2 of his children, one died of an illness, and the other one died of getting hit, actually falling off a carriage, a coach down in Troy when they were living on Ferry Street.
That's kind of sad. One thing I've noticed about cemeteries, because I actually wrote my first book sitting in a cemetery, is how many people died young, children in particular.
Yes, that's true. In infancy, there were even a lot of times that they sometimes didn't name babies right away because you didn't know if they were going to survive. And of course, this is the advent before we had antibiotics and things like that. So there were many, many deaths of young children. And particularly for young women, when they looked if you could survive past 5, you usually made it. And then another time that young people died, and for particularly women, is childbirth. If you made it through the childbirth, you usually lived to be a fairly old woman. But a lot of children also died in terrible accidents in the factories because you had a lot of child labor that was going on, particularly even in the early 19th century, where the pottery district, we kind of talked about the west side of Mount Ida. There were also a lot of potters that were along there. It is called the pottery district now in that neighborhood. And one of the things that children did was to take salt and throw them into the kilns where you were glazing. They have small hands, they could do that, but you get a lot of flashback, and so a lot of children were burned and died from those industrial accidents. Later on, a lot of children were injured in some of the factories. They were the Marshall Mills, who used to make cloth, and they would be running in between the machines to change the spools, and sometimes got caught in some of those. So there was really, it was pretty tragic. And of course, they didn't even change the child labor laws till well at the end of the 19th century, really going into the 20th century before serious child labor laws were enacted.
Next up, we have the grave of Samuel Wilson. Just to set the time frame, he was born on September 13th of 1766 in Arlington, Massachusetts, and he died in Troy on July 31st of 1854. He was 87 years of age. Now we're probably in the most famous, most visited spot in the cemetery, and I have to say this is an incredible cemetery, but this is the spot that I believe is the most visited. So Kathy wanted to tell us where we are.
We are at the final resting place of Samuel and Betsy Mann Wilson up here at Oakwood Cemetery. Originally, he was buried in Mount Ida Cemetery off Pauline Avenue, and then was reinterred a few years later after when Betsy died in the 1880s. So it is an interesting spot. There is also another historic marker there that was placed in the 1920s by their granddaughter. And honoring the whole, starting to honor this image of Uncle Sam. And so as we start to think about the man and then the legend. And so now we're even thinking about this all the way back into the 1920s with her marker that's there. One of the things that I think is really interesting, and I do a lot of tours of Oakwood Cemetery, is people always come up here and they went, oh, it's not very fancy. It's like, wait a minute, there should be like a huge monument or something here. This is Uncle Sam. And, we have to realize that Samuel Wilson, when he died, he was a good businessman. He was obviously an honored father and husband. But, he never knew he was going to be famous as this. So, it's a simple stone. And I'm of the urge that you leave it that way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people are like, no, it should have something bigger. Well, they did. His granddaughter did do one that was typical in the 20s. It's a very nice stone. And it is bigger, and it does honor that he is attached to this symbolism of the United States. And there's a wonderful flag here. And there's every year on his birthday, there's always a memorial that's here at the gravesite to talk about Samuel Wilson and his contributions, not only to the city of Troy, but to the greater good that happened because of the War of 1812.
And our last stop for today is right back where we started at the Hart Cluett Museum on 2nd Avenue in Troy. They do have a permanent Uncle Sam exhibit, and it's located on the lower level of the museum. And while the acoustics aren't very good in this room, it is the perfect place to end our Uncle Sam tour. Well, Kathy, we're at our final stop on the tour. We're back at the museum. We're in the Uncle Sam exhibit. So why don't you describe a little bit about what's happening here?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do here was really talk about the man and the legend. And of course, as we know, the legend starts during this War of 1812 and those barrels stamped USEA. And it really started to be symbolizing, Uncle Sam starts to symbolize our country. And it also is something that's symbolizing everything that is good. Now, those that kind of changes over the years depending on what political cartoonist is working on. But we start seeing images pretty early on in Harper's Weekly, but it was somebody like Thomas Nast who really starts to create this caricature of Uncle Sam that we're more familiar with, kind of the stripes outfit and the long flowy beard and things like that, even though we think that Sam Wilson himself was actually clean shaven, but we do know that he was fairly tall, or at least is reputed to be. But it's the most famous one is James Montgomery Flagg, and that is the World War I era poster of the Uncle Sam Wants You. And the United States government liked that so much that they recommissioned it during World War II. So that's where you really see it a lot. During the Vietnam War, of course, you see a lot of anti-U.S. posters, and they use Uncle Sam that way. So in Troy, though, it's the interesting story about how Troy decides that really we nationally want people to know that Samuel Wilson himself lived here, and that yes, he is the progenitor of our nation's symbol, and this story starts back in Troy. And while that has been argued, as we talked about when we first started this podcast, this actually did start in the 1930s with his granddaughter, with Mary and Sheldon, and then it continued on, and right up through 1960, there was a Veterans for Uncle Sam committee, and they actually presented a petition to the United States Senate. And, thousands of people signed this petition, and it was actually finally approved by the Senate and the House in 1961 and signed by John Fitzgerald Kennedy that Samuel Wilson, that Troy is the official home of Uncle Sam with his background of Samuel Wilson, and that he is the progenitor of our nation's symbol.
Now, about that poster, we're actually standing in front of a real signed copy by Montgomery Flagg himself, right?
Yes.
And
and it's what's interesting. That's actually a kind of a self-portrait of James Montgomery Flagg. He kind of dressed himself up in the costume and looked himself in the mirror and created that image, which is now so iconic. And yes, you can come and see that. And we have the story of Samuel Wilson the man. We have artifacts from his home and some of the early maps in Troy that show, of course, where the brick-making business and the meat packing was, and the fruit and vegetable orchards. And then, of course, the petition. So we have both stories down here in our gallery that talks about Uncle Sam, the man and the legend. And we can come and visit us. We're open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. We're on 57 2nd Street in historic downtown Troy. And for further information, just go to our website at heartcluit.org.
well, Kathy, I just want to thank you for doing this. I actually mentioned this to you maybe 4 or 5 years ago to actually do it, and we ended up doing the Russell Sage one first. But this is the original tour I asked you to talk about. So thanks for taking me out and showing me all the sights of Uncle Sam.
Oh, you're very welcome. I enjoyed it, and I'll look forward to the next one when we figure out a new topic.
That sounds great. Well, let's just go say bye to everybody.
Take care. Bye. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed that Uncle Sam tour. I first approached Kathy about recording this probably about 5 years ago, and she did generously offer to record this with me. But then this little thing called the pandemic hit, and that idea, of course, was placed on the back burner. Microphone problems aside, this really was a lot of fun to do. When my wife and I first took her Uncle Sam tour years ago, we simply walked around downtown Troy, and that's really what I expected this time, but Kathy surprised me with the locations that she took me to. Again, I do want to thank Kathy for her generosity in putting this all together. If you live anywhere near Troy or happen to be in Saratoga or somewhere nearby on vacation, be sure to take a visit to the historic section of Troy. And yes, the Hart Clute Museum should be on your list, as should a walk around Washington Park, as well as along River Street and the blocks surrounding it. I assure you there's plenty of places to eat and shop there. I should add that Kathy and others at the museum do walking tours around the city in the spring, the summer, and in the fall, plus they have all kinds of events throughout the year. And if you're interested, you can see their calendar of events at heartcluit.org. That's heartcluit.org. Just a reminder that the Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. So be sure to visit airwavemedia.com, and there you'll find a curated selection of some of the best podcasts out there. As always, thanks for listening and take care, everyone. Bye.